Alrighty then. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I know this is a late start to our season, but very excited to get going nevertheless. A couple of housekeeping items. For anyone who's joined us virtually before, you'll know how these things work. And if you're joining us virtually this evening, which I don't think is the case because this is the fullest house I've seen since 2019, it's fantastic, or maybe early 2020. Anyways, if you are joining us on Zoom, please by all means engage in the chat function. Highly encourage you to do so. You can share your questions in there, and I will make sure that they get shared at the end of the presentation. And of course, ask the speaker to repeat the question for those who are asking questions in the audience. If at any time you're encountering any issues, please feel free to email marmus@marmuseum.ca, and we will be monitoring that as well, just in case there are any questions or technical issues that come along over the course of the presentation. I would first like to welcome to the podium Rob Crothers, who is the current Commodore of KYC, past Commodore of KYC. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. I believe Michelle advised me this is the 7th year we've been doing this kind of evening with the Marine Museum, and we're very pleased to do that. And you're certainly all welcome to use the facilities before, during, and after tonight's presentation. I was part of a watch group, as I imagine many of you were, as the Keewatin came down off the horizon and then slowly grew and came by here. It's quite exciting. So we're all very supportive of what the Marine Museum is doing, and we'd like to, well, I know many of our members do volunteer, so we'd like to support the effort as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Right, welcome. This, Rob indicated, is now what I'm calling our 7th season. I'm referring to it as a TV series because we're just going to keep on going. For those of you who don't know me or our organization, we are now the Great Lakes Museum, formerly known as the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston. My name's Michelle, and I am the Programs and Communications Manager. I would also like to introduce a couple other members of our team. We have Doug Cowie, who's manning the cash box. We have Doug, Museum Manager Extraordinaire. And we also have Dan Rose up at the front here, who's joined us now full-time as our Programs and Collections Assistant. So if this is your first time joining us for Nautical Nights, welcome. If this is your return visit, thank you for coming back. I hope you've enjoyed our series so far. Lots of more things we can explore together in the future. Before we get started, I would like to thank Kingston Yacht Club for once again partnering with us in this series. We've had a number of successful years, and even through the pandemic, we've managed to pull together and continue to offer this series, and now in a hybrid version, which is absolutely fantastic, reaching so many new audiences. I would also like to acknowledge that the waters and land located within the Great Lakes catchment area have a long history predating the establishment of European settlements. The waterways in particular are to be acknowledged as the traditional trade routes of Indigenous peoples, together providing a network of trade and travel routes essential to communities since time immemorial. The now Great Lakes Museum acknowledges the site it sits on and the water it interacts with to be the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy and the Huron-Wendat peoples. We thank these nations for their care and stewardship of this land and water, and we are committed to sharing this stewardship moving forward. Just a couple quick updates before we get into the series, because I know a lot's happened at your local Great Lakes Museum over the past year. If you haven't already noticed, we have changed our name. We underwent a rebranding about 6 months ago now, and we're quite excited about it. A lot of potential. We launched the first new exhibit since 2016 back in June of 2023. If you haven't had a chance to come down and see it, I highly encourage you to do so. Find out whether or not you are fit to serve in the Naval Reserve. And of course, if you haven't already noticed, we have a new artifact. In fact, it's pretty big, hard to miss. Holy ship, right? Holy ship indeed. Very exciting, but a lot of exciting things ahead and a lot of work to do that. And honestly, we're very, very grateful for the countless volunteers who have put in so many hours a number of whom are in the audience today. Thank you very much for joining, and thank you for all the hard work that you're doing to keeping us on track. A couple other items. We do have information about our membership program if you are interested. And we also have some copies of the Keewatin, we're calling it a coffee table book, which is a fantastic, beautiful source of some artifacts and historical photos that probably you're going to see a lot of this evening, and some that you may not going to see this evening. Which brings us, of course, to the title and topic of our presentation this evening, the SS Keewatin. We are very grateful to be joined by Walter Lewis, maritime historian extraordinaire and a longtime supporter and friend of the Marine Museum, Great Lakes Museum, and who has been helping us over the last several months with researching the Keewatin. And that's been really helpful in providing us with information to support with our new exhibit development that will launch around the same time as the opening of the ship in a couple of months. That's right. Along with the script development, so all those experiences and tours that we're going to want to do on the script, a lot of the information that Walter has been researching in collaboration with a couple of other historians is very, very important to enhancing that visitor experience. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Walter to the podium and welcome him for his presentation.
Thank you. I have spoken in this series before, and I consider it a great honor to be invited here. And I understand that it's an even greater honor to be invited back. So I appreciate that. So we're going to talk about Keewatin tonight. At some point or other, I'm going to call her Keewatin. The folks that I talk to in Midland more often than not say Keewatin. The folks that I talk to in Thunder Bay say Keewatin. So there's a bilingual kind of thing going on here. There'll be a few other times where you'll hear me pronounce something differently more than once in the course of the conversation. This is some perspectives. This is not the whole story. When I started to think about what to say this evening, at some point later, I realized it was going to be a 3-hour presentation. And I didn't think that the Yacht Club would want us here quite that long, and that a number of bathroom breaks might be required along the process. So the next version of this that was complete ran for about 2 hours. And I had to cut that down dramatically. So what you're going to hear are some perspectives, and what I focused on here are the issues that lead us to, in fact, have her here. What it took that she's survived here into 2024. Which means that I'm leaving out a whole series of stories. Some of this in this audience, or who are online, may know better than me, probably do in some instances. I'm going to skip a number of things. Some of the things that the script that will be part of the tour of the ship, I'm not going to address here. I'm cheating on a number of things simply to try and get you out of here before everybody needs to rush off to the washroom. So those perspectives, we're going to start with a little bit with the head office. What's the railroad doing with this thing anyway? We're going to take a very quick view at the passenger deck, and there's a lot of the interest in Keewatin is in fact her role as a passenger vessel, and much of what's been written about her, much of the stories that we've collected about her are about that stage. And what I want to do, in fact, tonight is to give you a slightly broader perspective of the other things she was involved in and what it took to get her from here to there. So I'm particularly interested in the view from the bridge, and we'll come back to the head office before we're done, down in Montreal. And by the time that Keewatin comes off the ways, this is what the Canadian Pacific Railway looked like in Canada, coast to coast. Mind you, it got to the East Coast because it snuck through Maine and skipped major chunks of Quebec. And there's a bits of it that are running through some of the northern U.S. states in subsidiaries. But it's this stretch here between initially Owen Sound up to the where the CPR has its railhead on the lower lakes, the Soo, where it has a railhead that connects to those rail lines in upper Michigan, up to Port Arthur and Fort William. And at some point this evening, I'm going to say Fort Arthur and Port William because my brain just is wired and it makes a mess of that one routinely. Railroads, steamboats. Isn't this supposed to be competition? Well, in fact, almost every American railroad that got to a port somewhere on the lakes borrowed, bought, or built steamboats. The one that you see here is one of a set of triplets that were built for the Pennsylvania Railroad. This is India, China, and Japan. There's a theme often to the ships in a particular fleet. The thing that strikes me about this is that it's iron hulled, which is fairly early in the game for that kind of stuff. Iron hulled, but that only comes up so far, and then the rest, all of that white is wood from there on up. Those windows are square. It doesn't look very seaworthy if you're bouncing around on Lake Superior. One of the first vessels that really takes on the look that we're interested in is Campania, which was built on the Clyde. Built on the Clyde to run in a trade from Argentina, bringing live cattle back to Britain to be butchered. A cattle boat that's turned into a package freighter passenger boat. And Henry Beatty, who the CPR had tapped to get involved with running their fleet on the Great Lakes, his name appears in really tiny print over in the lower right-hand corner of this poster, liked what he saw with Campania, went back to the same yard that she'd been built in and ordered, well, he ordered 3, 2 of which were built in that yard, the other nearby. And here we have Algoma, and it's a fast Clyde-built steamship. Now they're saying Clyde, this is a mark of quality. It's also a mark of cheap because they didn't have to pay tariffs to bring it in from the States, and they could get cheaper. They could build it cheaper in Britain. But more importantly, quality. And it proved itself by crossing the Atlantic to get here. The problem, Campania was too large to come up the St. Lawrence canals. It was too large to go the Welland Canal in that period of time and had to be split in 2 in order to get through. Beatty knows this. It's proved itself on Lake Superior. So when he orders this from the Clyde, these are again too big for those canals. So they have to be built to be split. So not just, Campania was because they were bringing it in. These needed to be designed to be split in 2. But they were electric lights, luxurious fittings, and you would be in perfect safety unless you were out in a storm on Algoma on November the 7th, 1885, when poor weather and it found the rocks off on an island just off Ile Royale on the approaches to Thunder Bay, and the wreck split in 2. Oh dear, is this a problem from having designed something to be split in 2? The fact is, lots of Great Lakes shipwrecks split in 2. And there's I haven't seen convincing proof that this was actually split where the rivets were taken out when she was brought in. So for what that's worth, the other thing, of course, is she had sails, and the sails didn't help in that particular collision. They chartered Campania for a while and then built Manitoba in Owen Sound, the only one of the CPR fleet that was built in Canada. And the point with this, as much as anything, is that maybe we don't want to split it into 2, but those others did serve pretty well and for a long time. Algoma and Athabasca that survived that ran until after World War II. But one of the things I would just look how much bigger that is than the locomotive sitting in front of it. The fact is, you can put a whole lot more into the hold of Manitoba than you can in 2 or 3 or 4 trains that locomotive could pull. Fast forward a generation here into the early 20th century. CPR is spending money all over the country making improvements. They are double tracking the line between Fort William and Winnipeg because all of those immigrants and all of those people that went west on those freighters are now farming out west, and they're sending grain and other crops back to the east as a way to pay the bills for all of those goods that are being manufactured in Ontario and Quebec that are being shipped out. CPR is still using those boats to do that, even though they finished the line north of Superior. They've bought 2 lines that run south of Superior. It still makes economic sense for the guys at head office to pay the bills to run those 3 steamboats. In point of fact, they're building a subsidiary here called the Georgian Bay and Seaboard Railway that's going to run from Hog Bay, which I've put the chart up on Hog Bay. And CPR that had started running into Owen Sound, but they really didn't like Owen Sound that much. And brand new harbor here at Hog Bay, which is just around the point from Midland, just to the east of Midland. Hog Bay doesn't sell well. I mean, if you're in the real estate business, you know names mean something, and Hog Bay just doesn't sell well. So on the other side of the harbor is Victoria Harbor, and as they're marketing this initially, it's Victoria. Problem is, there's too many places named after Queen Victoria. Some of which CPR served, so that wasn't going to work. And so what do you do? And head office said, well, let's name it after one of us. So McNichol was one of the VPs of CP. Now, what they do here, if you look at that chart of Hog Bay there, you see two black boxes. They surround two islands. Labatt Island is in fact the one that's north and west, and Maple Island is the one that got named after Labatt. And basically what they do is they build out peninsulas there and dredge out the part that I boxed in. Courtesy, by the way, of our grandparents' tax dollars, because there's $750,000 or more that went into dredging that harbor that CP didn't pay for. They put a trestle out there and filled it in with the fill. So they created something out of those islands. And in the process of moving the fleet over to Port McNichol, bringing all of those other things, there's a grain elevator being built there to try to attract other people bringing in grain. They expand the fleet. In fact, they've been expanding the fleet around the world. CP is a global system thanks to the steamships. In fact, there are a lot of steamships in here. This is what do we got down there? I think there's 65 of them shown here. Empress of Britain, Empress of Ireland, built at Fairfield, the same yard where Keewatin was built the year before. And way in the back, and my apologies to the folks online if that Zoom didn't work there, we have Manitoba, Athabasca, Alberta, and in the second line, we have Assiniboia and Keewatin. Where those names come from, some of them represent Indigenous place names, but in point of fact, CP didn't have that much imagination, and they're named after districts. So Algoma, the one that was lost in '85, is that part of Ontario that goes in the southwest corner at Sault Ste. Marie and goes east as far as the Quebec border and north as far as James Bay. And then west of Ontario, we have Manitoba, which is still quite small in 1903 when this map was drawn. West of that, we have Assiniboia. West of that, we have Alberta. North of them, we have Athabasca. And down the western coast of Hudson Bay, we have Keewatin. All of these are districts. I can only imagine if there had been a sixth ship, they might have gone with Saskatchewan, or there may have been somebody else that had grabbed that particular name, and nobody cared about Mackenzie and Ungava, which are the other districts there. This looks a whole lot like Keewatin. This is Huronic, which is in the Northern Navigation Company fleet, built in Collingwood in 1902 by the same man who the CPR would tap to design Keewatin and Assiniboia, Hugh Calderwood. So even though Huronic and its successors, Harmonic and Noronic, are the competition, the fact is they share a designer. So here they are lined up with some quite larger vessels in the slip in Fairfield, waiting to have their sea trials, which they did in early September. And here they are over in Montreal. The CPR business of marketing itself is quite extraordinary here. And so there are pictures offered to just about any newspaper that could print a picture there of things. And my apologies for how badly these reproduce, but you get an idea of the excitement of. Now, one of the things I would point out here is, see the three masts on her? See the sails on her? You don't, do you? I've looked at over 100 pictures of Keewatin. There are no sails. Okay. She is in Lloyd's Register. There are three letters, SCH, which if you look it up at the front says schooner. And near as I can tell is the guys who did it, Lloyd said, well, she has three masts. Maybe someday she'll be a schooner. No. So gets to Montreal, is sent back to Quebec, delivering a cargo to Montreal. She had 1,000 tons because she frankly sailed much better if she was carrying freight. So 1,000 tons gets out unloaded, goes back up to Quebec, comes out after Assiniboia, which nearly sank when they split her. So they figured out what they were doing with Assiniboia, and Keewatin was fairly straightforward. And here she is backing up the St. Lawrence Canal, 2 tugs in front, 1 behind pushing. And here's the bow with a single tug on her coming through at Port Colborne. You get a sense of the asymmetry of the split, okay? It takes 3 tugs to pull the aft section and only 1 tug to pull the bow. And I would just suggest to you again, if somebody asks how strong were the subdivisions, the bulkheads in there, I can see where they've bulkheaded the passenger decks here, but not the hold. I have to imagine they did something because she was split right behind the forward bulkhead. So the bow's in good shape, but from this picture, I think you can look halfway back to the bulkhead between number 2 and number 3 hold, and yes, she's backing up there, so the water's filling in behind. But that's pretty amazing. Anyway, coming out of the lock there at Port Colborne, burning coal. Those tugs are working hard to move that section off to the Buffalo dry dock. And you can see how she was split. And one of the challenges in the dry dock is how to finger those plates together again and line up those rivet holes and put the rivets back in. You do it right. She stays afloat for the next 117 years. So they did it right. So then we have her in her first postcard there. You get a sense of the color scheme. There's a little more buff on the railings than there should be, but the buff was certainly on the stack. And behind her is the CPR wooden CPR elevator at Owen Sound. And we will talk about fire a couple of points through this whole process, because at the end it's partly about she's a fire trap, right? The only time she was in any kind of serious danger of being burned is at the end of the 1911 season, when she is moored just below the elevator and it caught fire. And if you know the story of Harmonic burned not because it burned, but because the neighbor, the shed next to it burned, and the sparks jumped. Keewatin was saved. The folks in Owen Sound think that that's why CPR moved the fleet out of Owen Sound, was that fire in December of 1911 at the end of the season. No, they've been planning on doing that move. They've been spending money. They'd spent millions on this move since 1905. But here we have the 5. And again, my apologies for those online if these pictures don't zoom all that well. So they're twins. So that's either Keewatin or Assiniboia. And as we move forward, the 3-master here with the smoke up is definitely Manitoba. And then we have Alberta or Athabasca. And then we have either Keewatin or the other twin up front. Spring of 1912. This is right after they made the move. Now, a little bit about passengers here. And this is the Toronto waterfront in 1912. Why would you want to go for a cruise on the Upper Great Lakes, I ask you? Even if you weren't heating your home in the summertime, the fact is, to make the wheels of industry turn, to make the wheels of the railroads that are down on the waterfront in Toronto turn, you're burning stuff that produces really nasty amounts of smoke. So if you have the money and the time, you get out of town. And one of the ways to get out of town was on a boat train, which had its own plume of smoke making its way up to Port McNicoll. And here we have, this is some pictures from early in 1916. This is a press junket, because CPR's marketing is all about, friends with the press. This is a press junket that started in Toronto and makes its way up to Fort William. Here we are making the transition from the boat train on board. Keewatin waiting. And among the other things about the CPR, they talked about traveling on board here and were extolling the natural air conditioning of being on Lake Superior. And these folks who were under the new, at that point, veranda deck, which was put on in the winter of 15-16, enjoying the natural air conditioning there. that's probably war work that they were knitting there. And here are some folks up on the shuffleboard deck. I have lots more pictures of people playing shuffleboard, including some folks that are in this room, and had to cut them because we're trying to do this for time. But historically, a lot of Great Lakes ships, this was known as the hurricane deck, which the guy over there on the right who's holding onto his hat, I think would agree with. The crew largely called it the boat deck, at least the bridge crew, but the marketing people called it the sun deck. So I don't see a lot of sun in this picture, but presumably there was some. I'm not going to use a lot of interior pictures here because they're in the books, like the one that's over there, and a number of other places. I did want to draw your attention to this one, though. This is one of those magical spots in the middle of the ship. This is the Flower Well Lounge, right, with all of those buckets of greenery spread across it. Well, the fact is that if you don't have those buckets there, it looks really kind of tacky. It's my sense that the people who built this were going, okay, we're going to take the ship a half. At the other end of this lounge, we don't want the top deck to do this. So let's put in something that's going to keep it together. And then after a year or two passed, they went, this is really ugly. We need to do something to decorate it. And so they put in the plants. Anyway, apart from the voyage that I will take you on in a few minutes here, the fact is that she did some special cruises, $2 return fare from Owen Sound. These cruises often went from Owen Sound. You'll notice down here in the corner, they're saying, have your meals aboard ship, only 75 cents. $2, you're going to go out for over 12 hours on board. You're going to want to eat, right? $2 trip, 75 cents meal. That's what they charged the passengers on board who were paying seriously more money to go to Fort William or to come back to Port McNichol, 75 cents for a meal. But that's what they wanted here. These are so you can go up across to Parry Sound, up the Bruce Peninsula, and there's another one over here to Port McNichol. There'll be a big crowd, but no crowding. Because, of course, this isn't a crowd, is it? There are, by this point in time, this is August of 1935, there are regulations about how many passengers you can put aboard a ship. And these cruises were capped at 850. I cannot imagine that any rational steamboat inspector would license this for 850 passengers. What I can tell you is there's no way that the 850 passengers could have got onto those 10 lifeboats or the life preservers that were on board. They have, you'll see some of the benches that have ropes around them there that they could throw overboard, and you cling to the rope till somebody comes and rescue. All I can say that there, but for the grace of God, was a seriously newsworthy event that never happened. Because the people who were navigating Keewatin knew their way around Georgian Bay, were careful. These were nice days. There was no fog. It was a sunny summer day, and we escaped that. There's not a lot of real numbers about how many people traveled on board. This is so a little over 4,000. I have another number that is in that same kind of range, between 4,000 and 5,000 people per season in a good one. This is the early 50s. But what strikes me with this particular one is this is the one year where the logs show us who went, how many people were on any given trip. And you can tell there is a passenger season. And it starts in mid-June and it goes to the second week of September. And if you were a university student, you might have a shot at a job. Because they were done, but although there are accounts of students going back to school, taking Keewatin out of the stew. The other point I would make is that there are passengers carried all the rest of the year, just not very many of them, but the odds are higher when they were traveling off season that they showed up with a car. And I tend to think of this as perhaps the traveling salesman. There's no highway that goes around Superior, and if what you've got are goods that you might have to pay customs duties on if you tried to drive west or come east through the States, it makes sense to put you and your samples in your car and come down to the Sioux and carry on going around to small towns and country stores trying to get sales. So that's my traveling salesman story here. And we need to move on here. So some stories here from the bridge. And there are very few pictures of her underway where there isn't somebody before 1946 on this bridge. There's canvas that goes over the top. Frankly, I haven't seen yet a picture of her with the canvas cover up there, keeping the rain off. This is an open bridge, and these guys are out in, well, we'll see some of the weather. Thanks to the Huronia Museum lending us, I had a chance to go through all but those years of the captain's, either the finished logs or the scrap logs. And most of them are extraordinarily ordinary. But I have page after page after page of notes of this, of things. So some of what follows here is drawn from that. The season begins in mid-April, and at least a week, if not 10 days before she actually sails, where the guys show up and start putting on materials that have been stored away in the winter because they might rot in the ice and the snow, like the lifeboats. Lifeboats are a good thing. Ron and I were discussing what this was, and our best clue here is that this is them hauling up cleaning supplies so they can swab the decks. There may be something else. The telly called it taking stores aboard. I can't imagine that the stores were loaded in buckets. The folks down, have you ever seen a cleaner engine room than this? I mean, this is a very photogenic corner of the engine room. At the beginning of the season, these guys are taking real care, and even where he's putting in the grease cups, checking the cups here and greasing her down there. And part of the reason this engine looks so good is because somebody was out there painting stuff with aluminum paint. Now, we're talking about having tours through the engine room, but I don't think in the spring of 1938 they were necessarily talking about tours through the engine room. So somebody, before we're done, somebody's going to explain to me why they felt the need are they preventing rusting? Are they using I've never found aluminum paint all that effective as a sealant, but in any case, it's certainly beautiful. And this is a Cinneboya. I will this up, but to give you an idea of the fact that it's a big job to paint this thing. And this is actually a picture that was done mid-season because the bosun wanted to take out some scrub marks. So navigation looks like a really straight line, doesn't it? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. You just go from Port McNicoll, you more or less go straight, and you end up in Port Arthur and Port William. Well, it's not that straight. But one of the things is that Keewatin is driven to a schedule, particularly during the passenger season. But they were very much aware of how long they were going to be getting from one point to another point to another point to another point as they were navigating. This schedule, which is the 46 one, has them leaving Fort William on Saturday, which is pretty typical, but leaving Port McNicoll on Tuesday. More often, she left on Wednesday than Tuesday, but it was basically up and back in the course of a week. In point of fact, she spent more time in port than she did cruising. The expectation was that they would get to the other end in 39 hours, plus a bit of time at the Sioux. Why is this push for the schedule? Because when you get to Fort William, there's a train that some of those passengers are supposed to catch. And if you didn't get there, you held the train up, or you left passengers there at the dock wondering where their trip west was. It's a challenge for the guys on the bridge every single trip that they make during the passenger season to get to Fort William on time. It's a little easier getting back to Port McNicoll because you've got the westerly winds behind you, but there's a push all the way along. So let's take a trip here. This is what Port McNicoll looked like once the dredges, $750,000 worth of dredging, what it gets you. And this is a really nice harbor that is reasonably sheltered, that is really deep, 25 feet, as it was dredged to. Over sort of datum depth, which means, depending on the depth of the lake, it could be plus or minus 3 feet from that. And they have the elevator is out to the hog bay side, and the freight sheds, the coal piles, and the passenger station is on the northwestern side of the harbor. So you come out of there, and they actually had to dredge up to where the natural channel came into Victoria Harbor. After which you got to snake through all of the islands, rocks, and shoals that are the southern end of the 30,000 traps for the unwary navigator. And in fact, once in this in the scheme of things, they actually got themselves just off Pinery Point, which I'm going to walk over to your map here. There, just in that general neighborhood, they found themselves on a rock. And then they found themselves off the rock. The guys go and check, we're not taking on any water, finish the trip. She never sank. She touched bottom at least, well, a couple more times as we go through here, but she never had to be hauled off anywhere that she was going. And there's a reason why, which we will get to in a minute or two. But having snuck out of all of that, there's a nice open stretch across Georgian Bay where all of the courses out of southern Georgian Bay converge off Cabot Head, and then out between Flowerpot Island here and Bears Rump Island here. Now, Flowerpot Island had an incident, Athabasca had an incident with Flowerpot Island in 1909. Manitoba had an incident with, a few years later with Bears Rump. Keewatin never did. Never failed to make that passage. Off past Cove Island, I just love this picture, Bud Robinson picture there of her out into the open waters and the northwesterly winds of Lake Huron. So nice open stretch through Lake Huron as long as the wind wasn't coming at you. And there are times when she's an hour late, 2 hours late, as much as 3 hours late, because it's blowing a gale at her as she's fighting her way up Lake Huron. And then when you get out to the other end of that particular passage, you are into, you're coming in to the chart on the right, where all of the routes from Lake Michigan up the length of Lake Huron and out of Georgian Bay converge on Detour. And for there is, thereafter, there is this winding channel. It's a new lake, new name now, but Mud Lake is what it was known for most of Keewatin's career. Before you get up into these very narrow channels around Nebish and then up through Hay Lake and up, I mean, at the top of this, they've actually cut a channel through an island. These are narrow channels. There is no margin for error. And in many cases, they are restricted waters. There's no passing. And the logs are full of the officers complaining that we're running late because we're behind a freighter. Coming up, going down, and we just can't pass them. They're dredging here. There's fog. Come to a full stop. There's fog. There's no running in the fog through this whole stretch. And in the early years, there were forest fires, and they got brought to a halt from smoke, for crying out loud. Anyway, we get up out of there and we come to the Sioux. There's one spot just above Sioux, the Vidal Shoal, where she touched in the middle of summer of, I think, 1952. I'm sorry, I can't see my notes here. Otherwise, I'd have the date in front of you. One of the things one of the challenges we had in this setup. Anyway, the Vidal Shoal, and she then ended up with passengers on board. Ended up after completing the trip just fine, got off herself, completed the trip, and then went around to Collingwood to have some plates straightened. But normally she would stop in the Sioux, which for most of her working career, for all of her career, there were at least two locks on the American side and the Canadian lock. In World War I, they added 2 more locks on the American side, so there were 5 locks to choose from. She almost always went through the Canadian lock, except really early in the spring, because the Canadians were later opening than the Americans were. So if she was making her first trip up in April rather than after the 1st of May, there was a good chance they were lined up with all the American freighters trying to get up through there. And when you get out, and then whichever canal she was using, she was stopping, and you see that yellow circle there on the right of the picture on the Canadian side. That's labeled Government Dock. At Port McNichol, CP owns the port. In Fort William, as you'll see, it's their dockage. Here, they have to share it with a bunch of other people. So there's a certain amount of cursing when somebody else is tied up at their dock. And the last one that they were cursing was the Alexander Henry, a name you may recognize. So up through the canal, and there, when Assiniboia and Keewatin are both at the dock, they use the whole dock. And there are occasions where, in fact, they unloaded passengers through Assiniboia, because Assiniboia was there, and they just rafted off her, and you just one gangway to the next gangway, off you went off. Yeah, okay, health and safety, right? Just stay on the gangway. And some other times they would simply pull away, or Assiniboia would pull away and let the other one come in when they had freight to land. The big treat here, and they always got to the Sioux midday. So part of this was, you saw this in daylight. You came up Lake Huron at night, but most of that trip up the St. Mary's River was done in daylight, and you got to go through the Sioux and then off out into Whitefish Bay, which could, in really early spring, that is Keewatin, by the way, along with Lemoyne and a couple of other CSL freighters, each of whom seems to be wanting to create their own track. But take a look, the next time you look at the bow of Keewatin, and okay, she can break ice. She can break ice better than some of the bluff-bowed guys that are just pushing at this stuff really hard, although obviously Lemoyne was doing a fine job here today. So off we go over Lake Superior, almost 190 miles of open lake, much of that overnight, arriving in the wee small hours of the morning at Passage Island, which is the yellow dot off Ile Royale, which is the location for her worst bit of trouble. She was coming up through Passage Island in the fog, going very carefully, very slowly, and the guys up on the bridge were trying desperately to hear the foghorn and get a fix on where it was. And at the point that they got a fix on where it was, there was a grinding down below. And she actually touched bottom twice as she was coming through Passage Island. So the crew, the bridge sends a bunch of folks down to sound the tanks. She's taking on water. Still, get the steward to get up all of the passengers, get their life preservers on, swing the lifeboats out on the davits, and we're still not taking on water. Okay, let's proceed slowly and carefully, right? And she's not answering the helm. At which point you send somebody else back to the taffrail who looks over and says, "Captain, I can't see the rudder." She left the rudder on Passage Island. So by this point, there's wireless on board. So they send a wireless signal into Fort William, and the James Whalen and another tug, but the Whalen you may recognize if you've ever, because it's still there on the Thunder Bay waterfront. Although it's had some trouble staying afloat here recently, she's still out there. The Whalen came out, and they didn't need to tow Keewatin because there was nothing wrong with her engines. There was nothing wrong with her props. They just needed to be steered in the right direction. So they had a line out to the Whalen, and the Whalen basically steered them into Thunder Bay around all of the things that could go wrong within Thunder Bay, pulled them into the Kaministiquia, the Cam, I'm going to say Cam from now on, river, and unloaded the cargo and then went off to dry dock. So that last stretch, we come into here, and I've got a better chart for you here in a moment. So first of all, when they were scheduled every time to stop at Port Arthur before they went over to Fort William. Remember, they're catching the train at Fort William. So this shed, those sheds on the slip to the right in this picture are CPRs. The one to the left is shared by the Northern Navigation Company, and it's taken over eventually by Canada Steamship Lines. So CSL's package freighters are stopping in there. There's package yards, and Canadian Northern, later Canadian National, come into the slip on the left. And the guys from CP hated being in there if Harmonic or Neuronic or Huronic were in that particular slip, because there's just no room to put, there's almost no room to put another boat in there. There are, in fact, pictures of 3 of them in there, but I'm hoping they're all really friendly. They just hated going into, so any excuse, wind, fog, somebody in there. Heck, one time the Navy was in there doing a goodwill tour, and HMCS Luzon was one of the 2 vessels that were in Fort William that year, and I think it was the Luzon that was in. If they could find a reason to avoid stopping at Port Arthur, they did, and then they would go around. And again, I don't have my pointer here, so apologies to those online. I'm not going to use the magic finger and point up here to where those slips are, and then it would come out that channel, come around, and come in the end of the can. Okay, that works for me. It doesn't work for the guys online.
We'll do it on the ones online.
Okay. So anyway, so around we come and come into the cam. You see those two gas buoys at the end? That's the key to finding the entrance to the cam. Before they put those gas buoys in, there are at least 2 occasions where the Keewatin sent a wireless message into Fort William saying, "Oh, we can't find the end of the river here. Can you send out a tug to ring its bell and blow the whistle so that we can find where the channel is?" Because either side of that is not deep enough for Keewatin. But once you get inside the entrance there, that island number 1 is all CPR. But all of those buildings that you see along from just where the coal plant is, all the way down to the end of the McKellar River there, where Union Station is here, all of that is CPR. And so she would come up to the dock just opposite Union Station, let off her passengers, go down, just down a bit, unload the freight. And depending on where she was loading freight again, she might end up going up just upriver a bit, because Ogilvy's is right there again on the western side of the cam, just above the CPR bridge there. So most of her time in Fort William is spent in that stretch of the cam that is in the lower half of this particular chart, and is illustrated in the foreground in this particular postcard. And I don't know if that's Assiniboia or Keewatin there. So how do we survive? Out of the dock, off the ways, she came with a double bottom. And that's how she didn't sink those times she hit the bottom there. Bent some plates. She had actually more trouble getting dings in her prop than she did with actually taking water through the bottom. Or she would leak occasionally because the riveted side, some of those rivets would get loose. So they kept welding the rivets there so that they wouldn't come out. Double bottom, and that quadruple expansion engine had the power to drive her through a mess like that particular set of ice. It wasn't necessarily nice navigating her in the wintertime. This is from Assiniboia, but you get the idea of what it's not unlike what we were there the other day, Doug, as we were going up on to the wheelhouse, up to the bridge there. And this is Keewatin there is tied up, and Assiniboia coming in through the ice on her last trip of the season. So what's the season look like? Typically, they would be out the last week of April. This is her last season, and they were a week late getting out. They spent 4 days in dry dock there in May, which is why those are blank. And then typically, she would have been another week into December where she was running. In this particular calendar, starting with August 14th there, you see there's wind every trip she made. There is no avoiding the fact that there is some level of breeze out there. The natural air conditioning is out there. But August 14th is a gale. And the one on August the 27th is a stronger gale. And if you look through the rest of the season, you'll find there are not a lot of trips after August where they had relatively smooth sailing up and down. And I don't think there's actually a day in the trip, unless it's the 12th of July, where there was no wind at all. So she looked something like that as she's bouncing through the waves there. Enjoy that on that open bridge. As this. So how do we avoid all of this stuff that I've just taken you around there? Well, start with this. You have a compass, a magnetic compass, and you know how much magnetic variance there is as you cross Superior with a compass. They had to be very aware of that. In fact, there are two compasses. There's one up on the open bridge, and there's another one down in the original wheelhouse. And if you look at those numbers, there's one that agrees between the two compasses and points they're out by as much as 3 degrees. She has a log line to tell how far she's gone on that particular course, which is dropped off the end, and there's an electric signal from that to the bow. That's a picture that I took from in the wheelhouse. There's a Mark III and a Mark IV of the Trident electric ship log. This is not that. This patent goes back to 1902. That log could be original. Now, she lost the line off the stern a number of times and had to take it in if there's any kind of ice, because it's a line dragging off the stern and at risk there. But so we've gone in this direction, and we've gone this many nautical miles. In fact, for them in the logs, when they talked about distance, they talked about distance as knots, which is basically equals nautical miles. In fact, some of the logs have knots per hour, and I know people. I thought, wait a second, that wasn't what I've always understood. But in fact, knots per hour was simply for them meant nautical miles per hour. So, one of the versions of this had an illustration of that, and I've taken it out. My apologies. Wireless radio came in less than 10 days after Titanic sank. CPR immediately ordered this for all of the Great Lakes fleet, probably for all of their fleet in general that didn't already have wireless, but the Great Lakes fleet all got it in April 1912, just before they moved the fleet over to Port McNichol. And up here on the head of the masts, you can see the cross pieces. I'll give a better picture in a moment here. And then down here, you have the wireless shelter, or as I like to call it, the radio shack, just because I'm a certain generation. Anyway, here you see, if you can see the lines better there, you can, all three masts, there's the cross pieces, and then the radio shack is right below the mainmast, there where the signals are coming in. And there are a number of stations where they can communicate to, and you've already heard a couple of instances where they were using that for the purpose. Wireless isn't going to save you, but if something goes wrong, you can tell people, come and help, which is a good thing. Visibility is always a challenge in those waters. Thunder Bay Chamber of Commerce will tell you it's the sunniest place in Ontario. That's true, but it's not necessarily true at 5 in the morning when you're coming in off Lake Superior and the fog hasn't burned off yet. So the yellow are days where they noted fog in the logs. The peach-colored ones are days where it was haze or rain that was so heavy that it affected visibility. And the gray ones that are down in October and November are the days when it snowed. So I think when I went through this, I found 6 round trips where they didn't have compromised visibility at some point in the trip. So, and here you have a glaring example of how good the visibility was from the upper bridge, as the people are getting snowed on there. I can see where that pipe would be essential just as part of the heating process of working on the bridge there. Here we are, and notice this object sitting on top of the radio shack. This is, I believe, without having confirmation, I would have somebody love to have them confirm this. I've seen them on almost all of the vessels from this period. In 1930-31, the Lloyd's Register said she had direction finding equipment on board. And I think this is the antenna for the original radio detection finding, which had to be turned in order to find a signal from a fixed point, which it got in dots and dashes, and say, okay, relative to here, we are on this course. Now let me turn it over here, and let me another fix, and then draw those 2 lines on the chart, and you know where you were at the point where you started doing the fixes. In 1938, the picture that I'd left out of that in terms of fitting up, that's the new omnidirectional antenna, and you can see its successor on board today. And here in the wheelhouse is the chart that tells you where the dots and dashes are. And those little crosshatches are where the signal from the radio beacon station is synchronized with the foghorn. Now, so the idea was that at the same moment that the signal was sent out, once a minute, the signal was sent out that said, so there's Cove Island, dot, dot, dot. So you knew you were picking up a signal from Cove Island, and you knew what direction Cove Island was, but you don't know how far you are away. But at the same moment, the foghorn started. And so whoever was monitoring that signal would then be going, and as a kid, when we were playing flag football, we went 1 steamboat, 2 steamboat, 3 steamboat, 4 steamboat, 5 steamboat, and you'd know you were a mile away. That's the difference between radio signal speed and the speed of sound. So basically, they're counting steamboats up there on the bridge, trying to figure out how far they are away from the foghorn. She's also among the first to get radio telephone equipment. which is put into the Radio Shack because Marconi is contracted to supply radio services to the ship. They put the radio telephone in that shack and were selling long distance calls to passengers. When they moved the radio telephone to the bridge, there is a memo in the log saying the passengers are not allowed to send messages. They're not allowed on the bridge. Keep them away. This is for company business only. This says that Captain Davis on the Keewatin was the first to make this on the Upper Lakes on the Canadian side. And okay, I can buy the headline, but if you actually look at the second column, it says he was speaking to Captain John Pearson of the Manitoba, which says to me the Manitoba got one at the same time. And the others got one not long afterwards. So whatever. The other thing that the real invention in compasses is the gyro compass, which is still, this is a picture of it down there in below the bridge. It's about the size of my mother's washing machine that I remember when I was small. I'm not sure exactly when it was installed, but the CPR, there are accounts of CPR installing gyro compasses on its West Coast fleet as early as 1923. So I don't think that the Great Lakes Fleet would necessarily have been too far behind. I don't think this is an original model. What real excitement is this one. Radar installed this trip. Underline, underline, underline. That's the most emphatic you will ever find in the logs. And this is July of 1946, and I had my kids translate that. So translate that for your kids, and it looks something like that. That was a Type 268 that they put on initially. Notice the shape of the antenna up there in the upper left corner. Lots of equipment that did not like rain, snow, or fog. And so they enclosed the wheelhouse, that bridge, finally, not for the navigators who, this is 1946. It's almost 40 years since Keewatin went into service. And these guys have been out there in the rain and the snow and the rest of it, unless they want, and they close this one entirely. You're not going to use the lower wheelhouse at all. So they're up there. Now I can only imagine, are there windshield wipers on this thing? I didn't notice any there. So apparently the lookout had to go out with a squeegee every so often if they were getting certain, if that awning didn't protect them well enough. And you see the radio detection finder next to the radar there. That's not the original radar. Here's a lovely picture from Jim Kidd of, and you can see the scanner that's up there now. This picture I think is 1963. There's they also have an anemometer up there, which is kind of small in this. I'm sorry, I pushed this scan perhaps beyond the visibility there. The anemometer, that's the thing that's testing wind speed, because they're not out there on that open bridge getting the wind speed in their face. So you have some equipment there, so nobody has to step outside. There's the radar that's there now. It was replaced, that original wartime surplus unit that was developed and was bought from the government of Canada. It was replaced in 1963 by a Marconi unit, which was replaced itself in the spring of 1965. They're pretty sure that's her last season, but they put a new radar on it. Now, I don't know whether they put an old radar on it because we're not going to be running it that much more, or whether this was simply cutting edge to keep her alive for the last season. In any case, some quick thoughts about her as a freighter. I slid, and what you have here are pictures of, here's the cabin pattern there, and there's these three really large holes that go through all the decks that they poured grain through. And then they would unload that at the grain elevators down at Port McNichol. Not for very long, but at one point there's during World War I, she had over 74,000 bushels of grain in those three holes. So a little bit of bulk freight, but that's not what she mostly did. What she mostly moved were bags of flour. That's the Ogilvie mill just up from the passenger dock. And I would note that it's 1948 when they started having the health and safety committees. This is them. I'm hoping that the hold is largely full now, but she carried up to just over 2,000 tons of flour. Was pretty much her capacity there. Often she would go with less than that, but typically 1,700, 1,800 tons of this arriving in bags that are anywhere between 100 and 140 pounds. So if you look at that pair of hand trucks there's 5 bags on that. So they've got somewhere between 500 and 600, maybe even a bit more than 600 pounds there that one guy has wheeled across the gangway and brought over for them to lower into the hold. Pitch into the hold in that particular case. In Port McNicoll by 1940, what you have are these electric trucks. Those are hand trucks. This is an electric truck, and it can take twice as much. Typically, you take 10 bags. You can take a half a ton on one of those, and they had upwards of 38 of them in Port McNicoll for the crew that worked in Port McNicoll for doing the unloading there. So they're scooting back and forth on and off with this, and they could get her unloaded pretty quickly, quick turnaround. The other principal package freight was self-loading. Well, there's the crew that would do that. The earliest I have seen them talking about cars going on board was 1919 when they let 3 of them off at the Soo. There is a story at the Soo where the water was low and the car was high, and they were trying really hard to get it on board, and they took the wheels off. And they couldn't get it on board, so they pulled away and left the car sitting on the dock. I hope with somebody that was helping the passenger wannabe actually put the wheels back in his vehicle. In any case, let's just see what it's like to actually... Somebody tell me what this car is. I'd love to know the model of this car. It's a Merc? Anyway, part of what he's doing is waiting for the people. I keep looking at the doors onto the freight deck and trying to imagine. I drive a Honda Civic, and I cannot imagine driving through those doors.
Those size of yours.
Anyway, the traffic with cars, these are the years where I have a sense of what the traffic was like all the whole year, because they actually track this in the logs. So this is again drawn from the logs. And by 1965, the peak years are the late 50s, 57, 58, 59. But by 1965, the auto transport traffic is still holding on pretty well, which kind of surprises me because the Transcanada Highway has been opened by that point. It opened in 62, I think. They finally finished. It's like a lot of other things where building over north of Superior is really hard. That rock is really hard, and the grades are really ugly, and dealing with, and the swamps are really deep, and the combination. So anyway, the single point of failure in the Trans-Canada system is in fact that bridge, as we learned about 10 years ago when the bridge failed. Anyway, in terms of package freight, one of the interesting ways to track it, in 1942, the captain was making lots of notes in the scrap logs about pilfering. So these are all penny ante kind of losses there. So I think it is somebody who couldn't afford the prices with rationing or getting hold of something like that. So you don't have the ration coupons. Maybe you borrow a case of slippers here from on board. What is striking is the range of things: hosiery, shirts, socks, slippers, basically, and then the consignees, Hudson's Bay, Metro stores, Eaton's, Woolworths. If you could buy it in a Woolworths, there's a good chance that units of that at some point were shipped west, whether it was going to Woolworths or not. That's the kind of stuff they were moving when they were talking about package freight westbound. And on that, I'm going to shift down to some final things. In the 50s, the big move is to oil and diesel. The entire Canadian Pacific fleet being converted over the course of those years. Assiniboia got an oil-burning boiler. Keewatin did not. CPR wants to get out of the coal-burning business, and Keewatin is left behind in that process. CPR, this is a 1963 brochure where they're still talking about passenger trains, although frankly, there's a whole lot of Canada that thinks, what are you talking about here? You're trying to cut our local service. But they've gotten into the airline business, and here they are flying across Canada, and a lot of the fleet, that map I showed you from 1923, across the Pacific, you can now only fly CP. And flights to Europe via CP Air as well. This brochure, 1963, says you can travel by sea on one of the White Empresses. My aunt came over in 61 on the Empress of Britain, which was sold out of the fleet in 64, at which point they only had one Empress left, and she was sold off in 69. In fact, between 1950 and 1964, so this is while Keewatin is still in service, CPR retired or sold off or scrapped 31 vessels from the CP ship's fleet. They were really only interested in rail ferries, because they still had places where they need to ferry things, and container ships. And they wanted out of the passenger business except when they were flying. CSL was replacing their package freight. Remember, Nautical and Harmonic, like Keewatin, are carrying package freight, and they built a whole series of package freighters, Fort Henry being one of them. We're in Kingston. I had to include the Fort Henry. Built in 55, and she's a serious competition for the kind of service that CP is providing with Keewatin and Assiniboia in the 60s, because they're transshipping into rail, whereas Fort Henry is an all-water route through the new seaway. So this all-water route for grain just takes the grain elevators on Georgian Bay out of the business, and it's a losing cause. The freight that she was carrying up to 1930, the first chunks of this are shared between 5 vessels in the CP fleet, of which Keewatin is but one. After 1950, that's just Assiniboia and Keewatin that are splitting the freight, and you can see how the westbound freight is dying off, and that eastbound freight that is the flour. Those new diesels are capable of doing what the steam engines weren't in terms of getting a nice, efficient train across Superior, moving that kind of cargo. The big change in the passenger side of the business is the Nautical fire in September of 1949, and suddenly people get a lot of attention to things. CP responded to that, so there are fireproof doors that are added. There's the sprinklers that you see all over the ship are added in response to that. The asbestos that we're trying to get rid of was there's a significant amount of it added to the ship at that time. They put in a public address system. They have been doing regular crew drills since Titanic, 1912. But the passenger musters there, which incidentally they didn't do until they were an hour or two out of port. So God help you if you were a passenger and you hadn't figured this out, and they have a problem in the 30,000 Islands. Because it's not until they're into the open waters of Georgian Bay that they go around and do stuff. And they're doing extra training for some of the crew who are certified as lifeboatmen. This pictures, by the way, CP was sending these all over the country. Those pictures I took from the Calgary Herald. And then we come around to the action in 1965, where there's just a whole series of articles about the fact that CP wants out of the transport business, wants out, that they're shutting down Keewatin. There'd been a major change there was a major convention of safety at life at sea in 1960, and they had 5 years to implement that. Canada passed changes to the Canada Shipping Act in March of 1965. The regulations enforced that as of the end of May, and part of that was you can't carry passengers if you have that much wooden superstructure. So one of the questions was, are you going to sell it off to be something else? Take it down to the Caribbean and use it as a machine shop? You were talking about doing a bit of machine shop stuff there in part of the, well, apparently that's not an original idea here. But this is the killer story here. This is the Toronto Star. I'll read just a bit of this. So the SS Keewatin, a venerable passenger ship that plied the Port Mickle to Lakehead Run, is a potential fire trap with a future. The 58-year-old coal burner was pulled out of service this fall because she couldn't meet Canadian safety regulations. So she's actually allowed to finish the season. But her built-in hazards are of blithe unconcern to some foreign ship owners. Several are bidding to buy her from the CPR and will sail her as a passenger ship. You know that didn't happen, okay? But that was the question. And then we have R.R. McGilvray, who is the Department of Transport Chief of Ship Safety Regulations. This article appears on the 1st of December 1965. And he's saying, we enforced these regulations because we didn't want a Yarmouth Castle to occur in Canada, and that was before that is the Yarmouth Castle, burned, which was in November of 1965, about 2 weeks before that article came out. Now, lots of you have heard the Gordon Lightfoot ballad about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. How many of you have heard the Ballad of the Yarmouth Castle? Yes, some people who have actually, some Gordon Lightfoot fans in the crowd. Yes, so one of his early shipwreck ballads is in fact about the Yarmouth Castle, which incidentally was owned by somebody who lived in Toronto, but was running from Miami to Nassau, Bahamas, had over 300 passengers and almost 200 crew on board, caught fire, and everything that could go wrong did while she was underway. So in fact, she didn't get a distress signal out. It was only because there were other ships in the neighborhood that saw the fire that came over and picked up the passengers. More importantly, when Keewatin was retired, Assiniboia carried on for a season or two as a pure freight carrying vessel, which she passed the regulations for being a cargo ship. And she was bought and taken down to New Jersey, that's Philadelphia across the river there, where she was going to be converted into a floating restaurant. Now, I don't know if this is an accident or whether it was a planned accident. Somebody can correct me in terms of the actual story behind the burning of the Assiniboia, but you can see she went up in flames pretty dramatically, as the Naronic had. In fact, Manitoba, which had been retired in 1950 after the Naronic fire, also burned in the summer of 1950 while she was at the dock at Stelco waiting to be scrapped, or in the process of being scrapped. Keewatin, on the other hand, has survived, despite well over 3,000 passages, like that would be going one, coming back two, well over 3,000 times up and then back down the lake. She survived. In fact, never got herself into any kind of serious trouble. Lucky ship, maybe. Well navigated ship, absolutely. Well built ship, without question. She was built to be a survivor, and she hasn't burned. Yeah, you're waiting for me to say yet. Please never let that happen. Okay, it is the responsible for any of us who are on board her at any time, visiting, touring, whatever, to ensure that that never happens. Here she is on her way back to Canada in 2012. I have a quick screen here to thank some people, but I'm not going to dwell on it here because I want to finish here with the story continuing. And I know there are some of you who have already volunteered to be involved. I hope some of the others of you will take an interest both in maintaining the ship as well as in telling her story to people that come to Kingston to see what an extraordinary thing. I mean, she was an antique at the point she was retired. She was I was told by my wife's grandparents when we were antique shopping in the 70s that antiques are more than 50 years old, which I think makes most of us antiques, right? There are some exceptions in the room, thank goodness. But the fact is that she was an antique at the point that she was retired. She was coal burning in an era of oil, and at the same time, CP did what they had to do to put equipment on board her that she could be navigated safely and well, and she was. So that's the story to this point, but it's by no means the end of her story. But I will, at this point, and I have because I don't have the browser that I would normally work with here, I'm not sure how long I've been, but you've been very patient with me, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Walter. That was a fantastic presentation and a great start to our upcoming season. I know a lot of you are going to have questions. If you're online, please feel free to submit those questions via the chat. I am monitoring it. And what I would please ask again or remind you is any questions from the audience, please repeat the question so that our audience joining us virtually knows what the question is. I will let you direct the question, and I'll be over there.
Okay.
All right.
I've already figured out that you know as well as I know that I've told a tiny fraction of her story, and I know others of you know other pieces of this. So questions, yes. If you explain something at some length, those of us in the room can enjoy this. Don't expect me to repeat a 5-minute story. Okay?
Just a question.
So questions, yes, sir.
I read someplace that when the ship was being built on the Clyde, it was originally for the Tsar of Russia, and he got financial difficulties, and CPR bought it up. Is there any validity to that story?
It's my understanding that it was designed by Hugh Calderwood, who was at that point, while he was a Clyde trade naval architect, was working in Collingwood. And I can't imagine that the Tsar of Russia would have tapped a naval architect in Collingwood to build something on the Clyde. So my sense is it's an interesting story, but I don't think there's any validity to it.
Something about him going to be working on the Black Sea, and he got involved in military things.
Oh, the Russia-Japanese War in 1905 was certainly a major piece there. But no, I'm pretty sure that CPR ordered this for themselves there in this particular case. And there I've already not repeated the question, haven't I? So slap from Michelle. Yes?
Are you going to tell us the next 2 or 3 stories?
There is what I would call so the question is, am I going to tell more stories about this? And the answer is that I have something that I would consider to be the rotary version of this particular story, which is a whole lot more about the passenger experience that I have included here. But we simply don't have the hour that it would take to tell that particular story. But there are certainly lots of them.
Future date.
Oh, that I will leave to these folks.
Absolutely.
I asked to come back to talk about the dry dock because I'm really interested in the dry dock here. And they said, no, talk about Keewatin. So, hey, I like Keewatin.
We're anticipating kind of an annual speaker event mentioning the Keewatin over the next several years. So keep tuned in, and we'll definitely have more of them.
Yeah.
There's only so much we can share in this.
Yeah.
Or come visit.
Yeah. Other questions, other comments? Yes.
You mentioned asbestos.
Yeah.
That was the nemesis of Alexander Henry. Is there asbestos in this?
The short answer is there is still, it's in the process of being remediated, which is why you can't go through certain parts of the boiler room. This is for our folks online. The question is, what's the story with the asbestos today? And the answer is, it's in the process of being remediated. Because, let's face it, in the 1950s, asbestos saved lives. By, what was it, the 1980s, the 1990s, we went, asbestos kills people. And so suddenly it's a huge problem. And yeah, so what went in has to come out. The key, of course, is it's not, I don't think, any of what's there in that spar original to the ship. So there's nothing there that compromises our ability to tell the story of the ship as it was delivered in 1907. Yes.
Pictures of the logs that you showed there, the whole, how detailed did it show the passengers as well as just the stuff from the bridge?
Okay, so the question is, how much do the logs tell us about sort of the passenger component of the traffic? And the short answer there is you get bits and pieces of the story. First of all, the engineer is keeping a log. The purser is keeping a log. The purser is in charge of the people who pay tickets, who get fed, and he's also the paymaster for the crew. So he's the one who's in charge of the hotel side of the operations, the passenger side of the operations. And he shows up in the logs 3 or 4 times, once when a passenger got sick and the captain came down and he said, okay, the passenger and the chief steward can take care of that, I'll go back to the bridge. And twice more the purser shows up because when you go and look at the purser's cabin, there is a wash basin in there and it leaked and it damaged cargo. Beyond that, the logs ignore the purser completely. So if you were a passenger in the logs, a relatively few things have happened. You got sick. You got sick and you held up the ship because they were waiting for the ambulance to show up to take you off at the Sioux. Or you died and somebody had to go because it was an unattended death and you had to deal with the police and the coroner in Midland. Or, and this is the big or, you were late. And they held people up because they knew that there was a passenger joining the ship at the Sioux and you weren't on the dock. Sometimes the whole train is late, which is annoying because you're trying to get to Fort William and this boat train has been held up because there's some switching or whatever going on. So there's annoyance about those. The short answer is I showed you some numbers from 1952. That's the only season where in the logs there are in fact real numbers that say how many passengers were on board any given trip. And there is nothing in the logs that says how many passengers there were for the whole year. There are entries in the logs that total up the freight eastbound, total up the freight westbound, total up the cars carried eastbound, total up the cars carrying westbound, and don't care a whit about the passengers traffic that was on board. That was the purser's problem. So the short answer is if somebody had kept the purser's logs, we have a much better answer for the kinds of information that you and I would both like to have about the experience on board ship. His wasn't the only wash basin that leaked and damaged traffic there. Pretty much, there's a lot of water being delivered all over the ship there to the passenger spaces. And every so often, the engineers would come and stop flow into a particular line while they repaired it. The engineers weren't just the guys working on the engines. The engineers were Joe Millwright, in the equivalent of that on board ship. If it was mechanical and needed fixing, you called up somebody from the back to fix your problems. Yes?
Which begs the question, do you have a sense of how many could have been required to staff the boat and what of its passengers?
So the question is how many crew were involved in staffing it? And the short answer there are two answers. One is during the season, and the other is during the off season. And the Zimmerman book has those numbers, and I have forgotten them.
87.
Pardon?
87.
87, thank you. So that would have been full season, everybody's on board, and it probably would have dropped down into the 30s there when what you were dealing with was a full engine crew, a full deck crew and bridge crew, and enough people to feed and change the linen. So the chief steward and the chief stewardess typically were there all season there. And those are the good jobs, right? Where you actually got 8 or 9 months worth of work there, plus a day off at home every week, which is really remarkable for crews to actually do this. Another point in terms of this is the question of unions on board. The crew is divided into two classes: licensed and unlicensed. Well, three classes: licensed, unlicensed, and the summer crews, which are pretty much casual labor at some level. You know, people that you don't expect to train very much, and you really hope won't foul up when you're trying to abandon ship. They actually included the stewards in the abandoned ship drills in the 1950s. They hadn't before that, which is interesting. You'd think that maybe anyway. The Canadian Seamen's Union, which was the communist union there that was active after World War II, they actually had a meeting. They delayed sailing one day so that the crew could go over to the to the Union Hall, and they decided not to participate in what was otherwise pretty much a Great Lakes-wide strike. They were going to keep running. Now, CP has lots of experience with unions by this point, so they're not freaked by this particularly. But the CP crews decided not to strike with the other CSU. They're not certified until the early 50s. And when the Canadian Seamen's Union, remember, it's communist, right? And we brought in the Seamen's International Union and Hal Banks, for those of you who remember Hal Banks and all that fuss. When they brought in Hal Banks, CSU was out, the CSU was out, and the SIU, the Seamen's International Union, Banks Union, came in. They tried to certify Keewatin and Assiniboia, which are the only ones that are sort of running at that point. And they fail a certification vote. So the unlicensed crews on this wanted nothing to do with Hal Banks and his gang, to the point where a number of them end up in the Norris Commission as examples of people who are on the do not ship list. So they were blacklisted by the SIU, which is fine by them because the guys that worked for CP tended to want to stay and work for CP. And they eventually certified just before the ship was taken out of service in 1963 with the National Maritime Union. Meanwhile, the licensed officers, the ones that actually had to pass a government test in order to serve the masters, the mates, and the engineers, they've been unionized all the way along. And in fact, Captain Davis that showed up here was the secretary of the union that was responsible for the certified people. And he's at the Trades and Labor Congress representing the licensed people on, but CP understood unions. They didn't always like it, and there were some fairly nasty experiences early on as they figured out there's riots. There were police and the army brought in 1909 on the docks in Fort William, to the point, in fact, where they had the crew and the office staff unloading Keewatin because the stevedores were all on strike. But that's another story, and we could get deeper into this, but I won't because I have no idea what time it is. But more questions if there are.
I have one.
Yes.
Here. Oh, go ahead.
So yes.
I just have a question about archives, whether any archives have come to Kingston and the museum in addition to the ship, whether essentially this has become a center for research on.
So are there archives on related to Keewatin? Doug, do you want
Just
to?
the logbooks that we
Okay, so the only thing we have are the logbooks, the pictures that I showed you there, and they're up there and available for you. I frankly, I was the one that picked them up from Midland. I brought them home and I took pictures of all of them before I brought them on down. I spent a day or so doing that before I delivered them to Kingston there. So I was able to work from digital copies of them, but the originals are there, but they are on loan. So they are not a permanent part of the collection at this point.
All right, I have a question.
Okay.
One last question.
So
Oh dear, and it's Doug asking the question.
the first three CP ships, we have accounts of them carrying immigrants.
Right.
Did you find any evidence that Keewatin or Assiniboia were carrying immigrants as well?
I found no evidence of, while the early CPR ships, that's Athabasca, Alberta, and Algoma briefly, and Manitoba. I mean, there's only ever three at one time. They definitely were moving immigrants west. I honestly found none as far as Keewatin was concerned. Basically, you were taking a cabin if you came on board Keewatin, and the freight deck was for freight and cars. Cars for freight. So I would have expected. I was looking for them carrying the harvest. Lots of folks from Ontario that went out on harvest excursions out west. Again, some of my in-laws' family went west that way, and that all seems to have been, as far as CPR was concerned, stuff they started taking up that when they got that Toronto to Sudbury line built up the east shore of Georgian Bay. That they were all those harvest excursions went basically back to Toronto and then north from there. Even from Owen Sound, there were, like I said, I would have expected them to have been engaged in that kind of travel. But if you didn't book a cabin, you basically had a piece of that steel deck to sit on, getting from here to there, and it's bring a picnic basket while you're going. That's steerage, but that's how the immigrant steerage. That's how that worked going up in those earlier ships. It's a rough way to travel. The other thing that I was asked by somebody else that I was rehearsing this with is, did she ever carry livestock? And the short answer is not livestock, but she carried flour. She also carried millstuffs, which is what's left over when you take the flour out of the grain. And the millstuff is what you feed to cattle, horses, those kinds of things. So she carried animal feed, but never live animals that I'm aware of.
Just a few parting words. Once again, thank you very much, Walter, for joining us for our first 2024 Nautical Night speaker event. Next up on the, I'm going to forget the date, on the 21st of February, we have another speaker alumnus, David Moore, joining us to speak about schooner women. So that should be a very interesting presentation. And if I haven't said already, or if you'd forgotten, just keep in mind we do have the books for sale on the front, along with Walter has a couple copies of a separate book as well that he's written. And membership information is also available up there. Some of our membership levels this year actually include tickets for the Keewatin tour. So please keep that in mind. And otherwise, I wish everyone a very enjoyable evening. Thank you again so much for coming and for joining us virtually. I apologize in advance for anyone on virtually for the technical difficulties we had at the beginning. Glad you were able to join, and welcome. Look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you.
Just roll down. Oh.